always 7 laps around the turning post in one race, matching the days of the week. The goals themselves have, like the constellations of the zodiac, each 3 pinnacles, round which the swift 4-horse chariots circle like the sun. The wheels indicate the boundaries of east and west. The channel which surrounds the circus presents us with an image of the glossy sea, whence come the dolphins which swim here through the waters. The tall obelisks lift their head towards the heavens, but the upper one is dedicated to the sun, the lower one to the moon. That was a quote from Cassiodorus, a Roman official in the early 6th century describing the absolute center of Roman sport and entertainment, the Circus Maximus. Almost 600 years older than the Roman Colosseum, the Circus Maximus stood in various forms, given a fire or two that burned down the place a couple of times, for over 1,000 years. Legend has it that one of the first Roman kings held races on a flat ground in between 2 hills, which is where the circus was built on over the years. This would come to be the largest stadium to ever exist. Some historians estimate that it could hold between 150 to upwards of 300,000 people at once. At its height, Rome itself was a little over 1 million inhabitants, meaning roughly 1 in 4 people in Rome could have been in the stands on match day. To think about that is totally insane. And the best part, tickets were free. Just imagine you and 200,000 of your closest friends gathering at the circus on match day, which in most cases was a public holiday, shutting down large parts of Rome and grabbing a few snacks and bevies, cheering on your favorite team as the chariots race around the track at a blistering speed, the clank of wood and wicker sounding as they bump into each other, the thrill of seeing a crash or someone come from behind and win the race. But there's a catch here. Your seat absolutely does depend on who you were. So senators got the best trackside seats, closest to the action along the central straight, and equestrians, the wealthy business class, sat immediately behind them. So everyone else, ordinary male citizens, filled the middle and upper tiers with more avid fans camping out overnight near the circus on match days to get the best seats possible. Women and the poor were pushed to the upper wooden tiers at the back, with one notable exception being the Vestal Virgins, who had premium trackside seats as a mark of their sacred status. Now, the Circus Maximus is actually one of the few places in Rome where intersex mingling was allowed. So you could see men and women sitting alongside each other, chatting with each other, and this be totally acceptable. Very interestingly, slaves could attend, but they had no reserved seating whatsoever, so it was basically whatever was open that was there after everyone else had gotten their seats, they could take that seat, or there was some standing at the very top, or maybe around the edges that they could also take as well. So the seating chart was actually codified into law by Emperor Augustus, who issued formal seating regulations after observing what he considered to be undignified mixing of social classes at public spectacles. He was reportedly horrified once to see a senator forced to sit among commoners. That's how ingrained the Circus Maximus was in Roman life. The emperor himself decreed a seating chart for the Circus Maximus. And just like in today's sports, there were teams that you could root for, primarily the blues, the greens, the reds, and the whites, named for the colors their drivers wore. The colors also functioned as the team's brand across everything: the horses, decorations, the chariots, the merch, the graffiti fans carved into walls across the empire. And factions weren't just teams in the modern sense, they were fully incorporated professional organizations, more like racing stables mixed with a modern sports franchise. Each faction owned their own horses, employed their own trainers, veterinarians, stable hands, harness makers, and doctors. They were a substantial business with significant property holdings in Rome, including the stable complexes near the circus itself. And each race, which they called a missus, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, typically featured 1 chariot per faction, so 4 chariots at the minimum. Though by the imperial period, factions often entered multiple chariots per race, bringing the field up to about 8 or 12. The standard race was 7 laps around the spine, roughly 5 miles in total, at speeds that could reach up to 50 miles an hour on the straights. And much like modern racing, strategy was very much a part of it. Factions coordinated their multiple entries. One driver might be designated as the lead, while a teammate played enforcer, riding alongside rivals to box them in or force them at wide turns. The meta, or the sharp turning post at each end of the spine, which is where the turn was, is where most of this tactical brutality played out, forcing a rival's inside wheels into a post at speed, which was both legal and very much celebrated. The most feared outcome was the shipwreck, where a driver lost control at a turn and his chariot essentially disintegrated, horses tangling, the driver dragged across the sand with reins still wrapped around his waist. Now, you could still win after this happened to you, but you sure would have probably rather have taken the loss and kept your bones intact. The races were a dangerous game, but one that offered unmatched prestige. So, would you want to become a chariot rider? Well, and one of the most fascinating parts of this story is that almost all professional charioteers were either slaves or freedmen, which created one of Roman society's greatest ironies: men with no legal standing becoming the most famous people in the empire. The faction scouted talent aggressively. A promising young slave with good horsemanship and fast reflexes might be identified early and brought into a faction's training program. Some were born into it, the children of stable slaves growing up around horses their entire lives. Others were purchased specifically for their physical attributes. Now, training would be vigorous and began very young. Successful drivers could eventually earn their freedom through prize winnings. Many of the great champions we know today, like Diocles, were freedmen racing under contract rather than as property. Freedmen could and did race, but it carried significant social stigma in the early Roman Republic and also in the empire as well. A freeborn Roman citizen who raced professionally was considered to have degraded himself, placed in the same legal and social category as actors and prostitutes. The Emperor Nero's enthusiasm for personally racing caused genuine scandal among the Roman aristocracy for exactly this reason. By the later imperial period, that stigma had softened considerably, and the factions had evolved into something resembling modern talent academies, identifying, training, and developing riders across the whole empire, with the best eventually making it to the Circus Maximus in Rome. If you were good at it, it was well worth it. The most famous charioteer was Diocles, who was born around 104 AD in the Roman province covering modern-day Portugal and western Spain, which made him a provincial outsider. He began racing at the age of 18, where he was considered relatively late for a prodigy. He drove first with the whites, then the greens, before spending the bulk of his career with the reds. He retired at 42, absolutely ancient by the standards of a sport that killed most of its practitioners very young. Let's look at his stat sheet here, and we know his statistics with extraordinary precision because a commemorative inscription was erected in Rome around 146 AD, almost certainly funded by his fans or the Red faction, and in large portions of it are still surviving to this day. The numbers it records are pretty staggering. So he had 4,257 career starts. Of those, 1,462 were wins, so he had a win ratio of about 34%. He had 861 second-place finishes and 576 third-place finishes. He won leading from the front 1,064 times and came from behind to win 502 times. He won races against all of the three factions, and his total prize earnings was around 36 million sesterces. Historian Peter Struck calculated that converted into modern wages, using the purchase power of a Roman laborer's daily wage as the baseline, Diocles earned the equivalent of around $15 billion over his career. By that measure, he is arguably the highest earning athlete in the history of human sport. He out-earned every modern footballer, every Formula One champion, every basketball player who has ever lived. The inscription also boasts with evident civic pride that his winnings alone were enough to pay the entire Roman army's salary for a fraction of the year, or feed the city of Rome for several months. So what made him the GOAT? The inscription doesn't just list wins, it categorizes how he won, which tells us something about his style. He was particularly celebrated for his ability to win from the back of the field, coming through traffic when other drivers had already made their moves. He was also noted for his control at the meta, the turning post, which was where careers essentially lived and ended. The fact that he raced over 4,000 times and survived to retire at age 42 suggests he was a driver who combined aggression with exceptional judgment and raw talent. He was also remarkably consistent across factions and across decades. Many drivers peaked young and burned out, or frankly, a lot of them died. Diocles just kept going, adapting his style as he aged and racing competitively into his early 40s in a sport where most men didn't make it to 30. Now, the circus, while primarily used for chariot racing, also served a political purpose, and no one else did such a good job at it than Emperor Augustus, who essentially transformed the circus into a monument to his own dynasty. His addition of the Egyptian obelisk to the spine of the race course was loaded with political meaning. It was a permanent, inescapable reminder that he had defeated Cleopatra and Mark Antony and absorbed Egypt into Rome. Every race day, 250,000 people sat looking at that obelisk. You couldn't watch the chariot turn the meta without seeing it. His pulvinar, the imperial box built as a sacred shrine, was essentially calculated. By watching the games from a structure that also housed images of the gods, Augustus was visually equating himself with the divine. Later emperors inherited this staging and used it accordingly. Augustus learned much of this surely from his great-uncle, Julius Caesar, who had used the circus as a triumphal procession celebrating military victories when in 46 BC, Caesar's quadruple triumph celebrating victories in Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa culminated there. The crowd watching that procession would have seen Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain, paraded in chains before his execution. Other emperors would use the circus in other, less effective ways. Emperor Caligula used the circus as theater for his increasingly erratic relationship with the Roman people. He was a fanatical Green supporter, and his behavior at the race became a kind of public performance of imperial unruliness. Ancient sources record him cursing and physically threatening anyone who cheered against the Greens in his presence. He reportedly had a racing horse named Incitatus, who he lavished with a marble stable, ivory manger, and jeweled collar, and allegedly threatened to make him consul, which was either a genuine act of madness or a calculated insult to the Senate, depending on which historian you're going to believe in there. Emperor Nero was so moved by the sport of chariot racing that he decided to give it a go himself. Nero's decision to race chariots personally was one of the great political scandals of the early empire. He raced first in private on his estates and then in the game in Naples and eventually at the Olympics in Greece, where in a race he reportedly didn't finish, but he was nonetheless declared the winner because the judges feared that refusing him might mean certain death or punishment. The Roman aristocracy was generally appalled by this. A freeborn citizen racing professionally was essentially illegal and was stripped of civic dignity. And the emperor doing so felt to many like a deliberate assault on the entire social order of Rome. The circus became the stage where Nero's contempt for traditional Roman values was most nakedly displayed, and it contributed materially to the erosion of aristocratic support that eventually got him killed. The circus crowd was also where Rome effectively took the pulse of the empire on major news. When word would arrive of a great military victory, the games were used to formally celebrate and disseminate it. The emperor would appear in the pulvinar, the crowd would roar, and the news would become emotionally real for the entire city simultaneously. The reverse was also true. The historian Tacitus records that during the reign of Tiberius, the mood of the circus crowd became a reliable barometer of public anxiety during political crises. When the crowd was restless or openly hostile at the games, emperors took notice. Tiberius, who genuinely disliked public spectacle and rarely attended, was criticized partly because his absence from the circus felt like a rejection of the Roman people themselves. Most in the Republic reveled in the games, much as we do now for our own sporting events, but still there were notable critics, most prominently Juvenal, a 2nd century Roman poet whose work in his written account called Satires during the reign of Trajan commented that Romans who had once distributed military commands, political offices, and the fate of nations had abdicated all of that responsibility and now only anxiously desired only two things: free grain and games, or, as we commonly say, bread and circus. He was essentially saying that the Roman people have been bought off into subjugation, and the emperors had discovered that full bellies and a little afternoon excitement kept the populace subservient, and the turning of the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. He was writing from the perspective of an old-fashioned Roman moralist who believed the Republic had represented something genuinely noble, a people capable of self-governance, and that the imperial population had degenerated into a mob interested in only its next meal and its next race day. So, was he right? The cynical reading on the games is that they were purely a manipulation tool, and it's probably too simple to say that. The emperors did use spectacle deliberately and politically, and absolutely they did. But the Roman people weren't passive dupes. The circus crowd was loud, opinionated, and genuinely dangerous when provoked. Emperors were booed at games. Some were publicly humiliated there. Caligula's growing unpopularity was visible in the circus crowd before it was visible anywhere else. The games gave the Roman people one of their only legitimate public forms for expressing political sentiment, and they used it. There's also the argument that Juvenal was romanticizing a republic that was never as noble as he imagined. The late Republic had been a period of savage civil wars, political assassinations, and institutional corruption. The imperial system, for all its autocracy, gave Rome 2 centuries of relative stability during which the games flourished. While researching this topic, I couldn't help but continuously compare our modern athletics to those in Rome. In my view, not much has changed. We crave high-stakes competition and celebrate those who rise to the top. Just as in Roman times, we have our teams we passionately root for and players we idolize. And just like in Roman times, those in power still use sports for political means. Anyone who has seen any sporting event in America knows that we don't start the game until we've all sung the national anthem, and in some cases have our military do a flyover. So I'll leave you all with the same question that Juvenal raised in the 2nd century. Did the Roman people willingly subjugate themselves for bread and circus? And are we doing the same today? With that, I thank you all for watching, and I'll see you again on the next episode of Heralds of History.